Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Talent Gap Fireside Chat, where we talk about causes of and solutions to the talent gap. I'm your host, Pete Strauss, and joining me today is Tyler Young. He's the CISO over at Big ID. Welcome, Tyler.
Hey, Pete. Thanks for having me. Looking forward to the conversation.
Absolutely. Thanks for being here. Could you give our audience a little background on your career thus far?
Sure. Yeah. So as you mentioned, I'm currently the Chief Information Security Officer at Big ID. Been here for about 2 years. Prior to Big ID, I was at Relativity, which is a leading e-discovery tech company. Was there for 4.5 years, helped build and scale out their security program. Prior to that, I was at Zurich Insurance leading digital forensic investigations. Prior to that, consulting, doing DFIR, incident response engagements. Before that, I was an intern with the Department of Homeland Security, doing digital forensic investigations. And before that, I was in school doing studying cybersecurity with a concentration in digital forensics.
Very cool. How have you found the pathway from DFIR to CISO? You're actually the second person I've spoken to now that took that same path.
So consulting in general, I think helps both allows you to grow as a business professional, but then also as a security professional, because you get exposed to a multitude of different companies, different tech stacks, different executive styles, different CEOs. I mean, just a full gambit of, drinking from a fire hose of these are the people that you get to work with at this company. This is the tech stack at this company. Oh, and guess what? They're all dealing with similar problems in different ways, shapes, and forms that all result in some type of breach or some type of security incident. And having to report and articulate the technical things to non-technical people in different backgrounds was it's like an MBA in 2 years of work.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, you hone your consulting skills and parlay that into being able to communicate with the board and other executives and internal stakeholders and stuff like that versus external stakeholders. Makes sense. Well, as I usually start off the show, we talk about the talent gap a lot, obviously. Would you say that the talent gap is real? And if so, what would you say it looks like?
So I don't know that the talent gap is a real problem. What I would say is, because the talent's there, the problem is, and it's a few things, and I think the current macroeconomic situations have caused a larger gap, and that security teams are oftentimes told they need to operate very lean with less headcount, not more. And so if you have less headcount and you have more needs for more security problems you have to solve, you're probably not going to look to hire somebody who's right out of college. Just being honest. You're going to look to hire an advanced engineer that can build stuff, that can develop, that can create automations, and that can help kind of streamline some of the problems you have or solve some of the problems you have today, versus the long-term game of putting guardrails around a new hire that can kind of grow in their career. You're probably not looking to do that. Now, some companies still have that luxury, but a lot of companies right now and everywhere across the organizations are looking to be lean. And so it's going to continue to cause this eventual gap in talent. I think the talent is there, and I think the gap is only growing because of macroeconomic situations and trying to be lean for investors and for the VCs that are backing companies and private equity that are backing companies.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I'm noticing much the same thing, doing more with less, lean security teams, more burnout, less headcount, CISOs seemingly having more responsibility, more stress, not any increasing compensation, and not a lot of times not a lot of buy-in as much as perhaps they would like, or the not having the latitude to build the teams that they really want to build. Because obviously, in a perfect world, I think we would all like to build talent internally and create some of these talent pipelines. And like you said, people are kind of being forced into hiring almost reactively and just filling an exact hole on the team for the short term versus looking at more of the long term. I mean,
and less ramp time, and yeah, there's definitely value of hiring somebody who's been there, done that, versus taking somebody from university or directly from a non-security industry without experience.
Is there any solution there? Like, I kind of view the problem as only getting worse over time, especially as I know we had talked about before, the introduction of AI and automation.
For sure.
You may be decreasing the amount of opportunities out there for people to get their feet wet in the industry. How do we long term make sure that there's going to be enough senior security people in 10 plus years?
I think that's the question that everybody's trying to answer, right? And you're right. Like, AI is only going to exacerbate this problem. The days of you could hire somebody into a SOC to do 24/7 analyst kind of work, looking at alerts and building out detections. Those roles are easily being able to be automated now, or to be kind of, you can have a more advanced engineer kind of streamline some of that work, leveraging something like an AI copilot to just automatically triage alerts or automatically run, another layer of detection on top of what you're seeing. And that's the work that was done for a long period of time by I don't want to say entry level, because I think that gives it a bad stigma, but oftentimes people who are just getting their feet wet in security. That was kind of the place where you would start. You'd start in the SOC. You kind of understand the skills. You'd understand the attackers, tactics, techniques, and procedures. You'd understand different attack vectors, and you could use that knowledge to then apply it to something else. Whether you move to cloud security and you're focusing on more engineering roles there, whether you're moving into an IAM role, it was an easy way to branch out into multiple different security avenues. And I do think that that's going to be going away just with the advancements of AI.
Yeah, and I think often there's a thought in the security industry anyway that people need to come up through IT first anyway. The way I see it maybe playing out is it's going to force people, instead of having that junior or entry level role in security, the SOC analyst role, they may have to come up through IT and then move over in some sort of lateral move into security. Can you see that as being a path, like somebody working their way up from help desk to sysadmin and then transferring over to, say, like a mid-level or junior to mid-level?
I think that's definitely a possible pathway. What I'm seeing more, and again, I work at a SaaS software company, but more and more engineers that have the development skills that are easily able to transition to a security engineer. They're solving very similar problems, just putting a different context to that problem, right? They're building code to do some type of output, and in turn, you can use that exact same skill set to build code to solve a security output. And so if you have the right security architect in place and you put a really good amount of developers or a good amount of software engineers around them, you can easily start teaching them security one-off things.
Yeah, for sure. What do we do with all the people that are trying to break into security right now? And I think break in is an apt term given how difficult it seems to be. I just talked to Cyber Florida today about that, kind of level setting expectations with that audience to say, hey, it's going to take you a number of months. And, I would put the number at somewhere around tens of thousands of people trying to get their first security role right now. What do we do with all those folks? Is there any sort of solution? Like, what companies are able to onboard some of these people in your mind?
So I think there's always opportunities. I think it's just going to get to the point where there's not the quote unquote unicorn that everybody's looking for. When that person doesn't exist, then you'll see people taking more of a chance and giving people the opportunity to grow, which is, something, at Relativity, my last gig before Big ID. We had a really good sized security team. We had really good guardrails in place, and we actually worked with a program called YearUp, a local. They do more of like inner city alternative education to going to get a college degree, teach young people business skills, how to go to work in the workplace, how to present yourself in the workplace, and they do like a apprenticeship kind of program. Well, this is something that we did. We worked closely with YearUp, and we built this cyber guild kind of program where the whole goal was giving gamified cybersecurity training to a few select students at YearUp, and then in turn, putting them in a more like security operations or entry-level cybersecurity kind of role for an internship after the completion of the program. And we saw great success with that. And I think there's a few other companies in the Chicago area specifically that do this as well, partnering with YearUp. And I think that's a great way to solve some of the talent gap. The flip side of this is large organizations are always going to hire. Large organizations, your MSSPs, your MDRs, they're going to always continue to hire the analyst type roles in bulk. So I do think there's always going to be an opportunity. Now, there's 100 of those companies that can do that at scale, and I don't know that they're going to hire 10,000 employees in specific security roles a month in that. But yeah, it's definitely an interesting problem. And I think we're all trying to solve that. I think the one thing we can do to make some of it more streamlined and alleviate some of the pressure of looking for this unicorn is some of the job descriptions that you read for like entry level roles that are asking for like 10 years of security experience, like no one's going to go to an entry level role with 10 years of security experience, because like what we just talked about, there's a talent shortage, and those people have really good high paying jobs, and they're constantly jumping from job to job because they're getting either paid better benefits, better opportunity. Maybe they're fully remote. Maybe it's a dream company they always wanted to work for. Those opportunities are there.
Yeah. And kind of going back to the macroeconomic factors that you'd mentioned before, we've recently seen kind of the pendulum swing to one side, whereas, year and a half ago, it was on the other side where the employees or potential employees, candidates had all the power. Now the employers have all the power, and they're seeing the proliferation of candidates on the market that may even be highly experienced security people. They feel like, okay, well, we can be super selective. We can put 15 must-have requirements on this job description. And be more selective. But, when there's that many security people that are already experienced on the market, that necessarily pushes out the people that don't have any experience. If even the experienced people are struggling to find jobs.
And what's interesting too about this is like you mentioned the magnitude of people looking for jobs. If you look at the open security roles, there's equally as many security roles open for people that are for people to apply to. Don't know who fills them, but some of the job descriptions are still absurd, in my opinion. So I think the jobs are, I guess if you like really dig into this, like the jobs are there, the people are there. We're missing the conduit to connect them together.
I agree. It's sometimes the way I describe it, it's more of a matching problem than anything else. We have an equal number of people over here and jobs over here, but we just can't seem to somehow get them together. What do you think are some of the biggest blockers there? Like, is it process? Is it poorly trained recruiters? Like sometimes I think. What are your thoughts on that?
I don't know that I would say poorly trained recruiters. I think some of it is overwhelmed recruiters, because they're also short-staffed in a lot of cases, and they have 1,000 roles to fill across a Fortune 100 organization, and there's like 10 recruiters, and so sometimes that causes some of the issue. I think the other problem is you look at roles and there's hundreds of people applying for a role. Well, the chance of your resume getting looked at when there's 1,000 people or 100 people applying for a role continues to go down. And eventually it's like playing the lotto. Like if somebody looks at your resume, maybe you'll get a call. And like it's crazy. So there's a little bit of that. There's just, the funnel has expanded so much that there's so much, you have to cut through the noise, and there's not really maybe the tools to cut through the noise. There's always, there's, talent management solutions and things out there, but maybe those tools could use a fine tune in how to really find the right candidates. Again, like the job descriptions, I think people are looking for a unicorn because they want to do more with less. Their budgets aren't necessarily getting cut, but they're being scrutinized more than they were, 2 or 3 years ago in security specifically. So that also, I think, plays into it.
Yeah, I think it's a multivariate problem, obviously. Mm-hmm. I see it more as a people and process issue than I do a technology issue. And for as much press as the applicant tracking systems and their quote unquote AI capabilities get, as somebody who recruits for a living, I can tell you, I think the majority of the problem is recruiters not knowing what they're looking for, and having this focus on inbound applicants, I think, is the biggest problem. When you see a couple thousand applicants to a job, like you said, there's really no reasonable way for somebody to get through that. And especially since there's not AI auto-rejecting people like people think happens. I've done research on this, the most any ATS can do is rank candidates. But at the end of the day, it's still on a recruiter to go through those applications and either say yes or no or invite to interview. So yeah, they're too overwhelmed with too many applicants. And I think a lot of these issues would go away if recruiters spent more time doing outbound and reaching out to candidates that they look like they're a fit on paper versus trying to parse through thousands of applicants and maybe only getting a couple that are actually qualified.
How automated is the reach out process? Because there's jokes in some of the inner circles of CISOs where we get job offers for entry level SOC analysts, and you're kind of like yourself, did you look at my LinkedIn? And you usually don't reply to them, right? They're just in mails. But how much of that process is being automated? The reach out and finding talent.
Yeah, less than you might think. I think the biggest problem is email blasts, and those are an artifact of the old school hiring processes of the early 2000s. And recruiting management, I used to work for a huge corporate staffing firm, won't say who, but it was very much about volume. And I found recruiting and security that it needs to be much more qualitative, much more white glove, quality focused than it should be volume. And volume always plays some sort of factor because the more people you reach out to on average, the more placements you'll make. But you can't sacrifice quality for quantity. But what often happens is recruiters, recruiting management, they're applying these old school concepts of volume as the only thing that matters. And so that focus and focusing too much on KPIs and numbers and metrics and all that ends up leading to behavior that you wouldn't want, like email blasts, which is where or in-mail blasts, which is where a lot of these things are coming from. They may put in a very simple Boolean search string or just type in a job title, and then anybody who has ever been that job title at any point in their career gets that automated message. But at the end of the day, it's still a recruiter going to like search results and then clicking select all and then hitting the button, and then it sends a template. So, but yeah, I don't think it's like an AI out there deciding who's a fit and then, sending out these messages, at least not yet.
Not yet. Maybe it's a good product idea.
Yeah. Well, and I don't think most people who are not in recruiting realize how manual a lot of this stuff is and how much time it actually takes, to reach out to 1,000 people to get on average, 100 people to respond, to get 40 people on the phone, to get 3 people that are a fit and 1 person to get an offer. It's very much a numbers game. But yeah. And then 2, based on all those numbers, you have to look at what the talent pool looks like. So often, I think a lot of companies struggle to find people because they're limiting their talent pool too much, whether it's having crazy job descriptions, like you said, or focusing on a specific geographic area where maybe not a lot of those people exist. And so you're only seeing a fraction of what's actually available on the market if you're only, restricted to a specific geographic region. What are your thoughts on hiring in that way? Like, how do you view talent pools, and, how do you determine your requirements, I guess, for who the recruiter should be reaching out to?
So I think looking at the organization that so 2 things. 1, I'm a big believer in building your network. And I think it's imperative that every security leader, every leader in any facet, whether the CEO, the CFO, or the CISO, your job, a good chunk of your job is to always be recruiting, to always be networking, and always to be connecting with people that are interesting, and that you could in the future see either working with, working for, or in some capacity crossing paths. Absolutely imperative. I think that doesn't happen enough. And I think that's something that we need to change as security leaders. Specifically the security leaders, but then also, like I said, all of the C-suite. So that's problem 1. I think there's obvious problems when it comes to tech in general, and the candidate pool is often very similar. And I think it's always important that you need to cast a wide net to get the best talent, not just focusing on the same universities or the same locations or the same, diversity metrics, whatever they may be. I think it's important to cast a wide net on all that stuff, because to truly get the best talent, you really need to look everywhere. And there's tons of different, there's women in tech groups, there's veteran groups, there's different diversity tech groups. Putting these job postings in multiple places is extremely important. And talking at some of these places in conferences, and it's really important to build that brand, get yourself out there, to really cast a wide net, because if you really want to find the best people, that's what you have to do. The other thing is being, like you mentioned, being very targeted with who you're searching for. And for example, if you're at a tech company, going to, and this isn't always true, but looking for a cloud security engineer who's at a small credit union or a bank probably doesn't necessarily translate one-to-one with what you're looking for. But if you're at for example, Big ID, we're a SaaS software company. And if I'm looking for a security engineer, I would love to find somebody who's working at a hyper growth cloud native SaaS security company or SaaS company in general, because I think the skills translate really well. And then so that's like great. And finding those people are they're out there, and typically you're going to pay more premium because you're doing selective recruiting and you're trying to find very specific people, and they know who they are. Like they're sought after, highly talented people. So yeah, there's that component of it as well.
Yeah, one trap that you can fall into there in looking for the quote unquote ideal candidate that comes from, that similar background. And this is something I've encountered working with a lot of consulting firms over the years, is there's a sense that if you don't come from a direct competitor or another consulting firm, you can't do the job. And so that really, really restricts the talent pool. Mm-hmm. I think there's a lot of individuals out there that could be very good for consulting, say, that just aren't in consulting yet. The challenge is, how do you identify those intangibles like consulting style or, client-facing ability without actually talking to somebody? There isn't really a shortcut to that, I don't think. I think you, like you said, have to cast a wider net and just take the time to talk to people to identify sort of diamonds in the rough.
Building your network is honestly the most important thing you can do. It's so cliche, but it's so important.
Yeah, and I've been speaking to a lot of CISOs lately. I saw some number here published recently where it was like 75% of CISOs are considering a career move right now, or are currently unhappy in their role, which is crazy to me. But, I've spoken to maybe 20, 30 CISOs over the last couple of months. And one thing, a recurring theme I've heard is, I was relatively comfortable in my last role and I really didn't keep up with networking. So now I really don't know what to do. And when there's not as many CISO jobs out there, like right now, these folks are really struggling to find something else. So like you said, if you can continually be doing that and just make that a part of your professional cadence, every week to be keeping up with contacts and stuff. What are some of the best, networking tips or venues for doing so that you found over the years?
Some of the Slack groups are awesome. There's a couple of really good CISO Slack groups that are very active with like thousands of CISOs in them. And they're great because you can bounce ideas off each other. You can, share talent. So you have somebody on your team that, you think is ready for the next level, and you don't necessarily have the budget or the opportunity at your place. People are sharing top talent. It's just a great resource to have. And I think like at the end of the day, like we're all in this together. We all face most of the same challenges, some at different scales, obviously, in different genres of industry, but are all facing very similar things.
For sure. Yeah. And another great thing about those, private groups and networking chances, you're able to get back channel feedback on a lot of different things, like candidates, like potential new employees. Often I'll hear from a client that I send a candidate over to. They're like, "Oh yeah, we actually know of this person for good or for bad, through our back channels, people that have worked with this person before." Security is such a small industry for as many people are in it. I think you'd mentioned that you're often encountering some of the same challenges from CISO to CISO. What about from the hiring perspective? What would you say are some common ones that maybe you or other folks have experienced over the years?
Common challenges, or
like for hiring, recruiting, getting good people on board, or identifying who's good and separating who's good from who's not?
So I think it's always important to have data behind any decision you make, and going into especially if it's a technical role. Like currently, and at my last place, we have very detailed technical hands-on tests that we'll give candidates as like a first round pass. And if you can do it, then you kind of get your foot in the door. And it also gives us the ability to send, say we get 5,000 people applying for a role for a security engineer. You can kind of get 5,000 people at least an acknowledgement of like, hey, sure, we'll talk to you regardless of, your background, your skill set, if you can do this test. And if you can take this test and you can pass and you can write this code and you can find this malware or debug this thing or look at this log and tell us what's happening, we know you have the fundamental skills, and you can kind of pass through to the next round. And that's when we can kind of take the next step and look at the resume and start digging in a little deeper to some of the experience stuff and the personal stuff. And do you fit the culture of the company and the team and that kind of that next step? So I think it's really important, especially for technical roles. It's much more difficult when you're looking at leadership roles. And oftentimes the leadership roles are either a network thing. So somebody said, hey, I have a GRC leader open. Does anybody have somebody? It's like, oh yeah, I know somebody who's looking. And like, those are kind of like shifted. So you already have that like trust that person's quality, because you have somebody that you also trust, or somebody in your trust circle that says they kind of like have affirmed that. But I think it's really important for the technical roles to have some type of test that kind of just data, black and white. There's no biases included in this. There's nothing. It's just that, did you answer the problem correctly? And if you answered it correctly, then you probably can do the job, and let's talk. And so I think that's important.
Yeah, that having that sort of great equalizer where you don't allow biases to creep in and it becomes purely about somebody's ability to do the job is great, because I think
that's
in
all
a lot
that matters.
of hiring. Yeah, I mean, in a lot of hiring processes, I've seen the biases of the hiring manager will often get in the way of somebody that I think would be perfect for the job. It could be something as simple as, well, their job history isn't stable, or they didn't come from this school, or they didn't graduate college, or they don't have the certification. It's like, does any of that really matter? Does it matter if they can do the job and do it well and be a good fit for the team and the culture? Speaking of culture, I guess, and trust, how do you build a cohesive culture and trust within your team as a leader?
So I think there's a couple things. I think one, it's extremely important to be a good listener. And when you have a leadership team around you and realizing that you don't know everything as a CISO, I'm not a GRC expert at all. Maybe on the forensics and incident response side, I would consider myself, pretty well versed in those skills, but those skills diminish quickly when you start focusing more on business challenges and business problems. And so it's really important to surround yourself with leaders that you trust, that have, that have the experience, that have been there and done that. And then giving them the opportunity, giving them the canvas to paint their own picture is kind of it's extremely imperative to be able to allow that. And then also in turn, that builds the trust, right? Like, you give somebody the opportunity to build an entire cloud security program from scratch. You're blindly trusting them. You probably, again, like, we've probably hired people that we've had in our network. And so you kind of have that potential, like, what they're capable of, but giving them the opportunity at a company where you're responsible for the risk is still like, there's something to be said about that. And so that's where trust kind of gets developed. You give people the opportunity, they paint the picture, they execute on it. And at the end of the day, you kind of have that everlasting trust with that person, because what they've done is they're able to show you the strategy, execute it. And now it's something that you don't have to worry about as the CISO, because you have enough other risk related factors to worry about. And then you can continue to give that person more and more. And that trust just keeps going back and forth. And as they grow in their career, they go to their next role, you move them onto their next role. Maybe it's not even in your organization, but it's just a continuation of that partnership.
Yeah, that's great. Trusting somebody to take something on and being able to delegate that, like you said, that especially for highly motivated people, intellectually curious people that like to be challenged, giving them the reins and allowing them some autonomy to see something through to the end. Certainly a great way. And you'd mentioned another thing there where even if they're basically continuing to grow and you don't have the right role on your team, maybe, growing elsewhere, how do you legislate for that? How do you, especially if somebody has spent a couple of years in your organization and they have all this institutional knowledge and they have a breadth of skills that are patching a lot of holes basically on your team? What do you do if it's really their time to go? How do you, I guess, prepare for that?
So there's this book called The Alliance that was written by the founders of LinkedIn. And it basically talked about managing talent in the digital age, where the days of somebody working at a company for 10, 20, 30 years, those days are gone, for sure gone. But how do you manage talent where you remove this quote unquote tabooness of like, oh, I shouldn't tell my boss that I'm looking for a new role, or that I want to be, I want to be a CISO somewhere. How do I do that? And it's having these very open talent conversations, allowing the employee to feel like they own their career while guiding them to their path. And so whether it's things like tours of duty. So if you have somebody on your team who's like, hey, I really want to work, be a DevOps engineer, and there may be a security engineer, giving them a tour of duty with DevOps internally. So building these like internal tour of duty programs is extremely important. But then it's also like, I think when I look back on my career, one thing that I, aspire to have is Like they say, leaders leave a legacy of leaders. And I think at the end of the day, regardless of business success and financial success and roles that you've had, I think at the end of the day, the most important thing is if you can look back and see like your coaching tree of all the CISOs or all the security leaders that you've placed and you've helped get to their next level, that to me is the most important thing that I could ever do in my career. And so it's kind of like flipping it on its head, right? Like you're not just being selfish. It sucks, right? You lose really top talent, but at the end of the day, you can find somebody else to groom into that role that maybe somebody else needs that opportunity. But getting a leader that you have reporting to you to a new role, there's no better feeling of seeing that person be successful somewhere else because you helped them get there or you contributed to that growth. And I think that there's nothing better than that.
That's awesome. Yeah. I mean, and even if you are selfish, say, the fact that you have an open dialogue with this person that you're managing, you're not caught off guard if they're leaving. The worst thing that can happen is if somebody leaves and it completely caught you off guard, then you're really reactive in your hiring and you're in a bad spot. And, you may have to pay the moon for that next person, pay to them just to get them on board as quickly as you need them. And I think a lot of the hiring issues we see are due to reactive hiring where, people are just caught so unaware that their people are looking around. And it happens more and more these days with, like you said, macroeconomic picture being what it is and teams being stretched thinner. If you can have that open dialogue with your team to know when they're unhappy, that's great. And if you can head off any objections or discomfort they may have at the past, and if there is anything you can do to fix it, you're more likely to keep people around. Any thoughts on doing more with less these days? Like any best practices as far as managing talent, budget, that sort of thing when you may not have all the resources that you would perhaps like to have?
Yes and no. I think it's important as security leaders to identify potential security related risks, how they tie to the business. And I think it's also extremely important to be able to articulate the value of your security program, especially at like a SaaS company as a differentiator from your competitors. And then the situation changes. It's no longer security as a cost center. It's security as an enabler of the business that allows you to close big deals, that allows your customers to feel comfortable using your product and trusting them, with your data and your connections to their environments. And so I think that's one thing as security leaders we need to do better. It's stop talking about, I need this to solve this risk, but what business risk does this directly solve? How can I help increase revenue with the security things that I'm asking for, and being able to paint that clear picture for your executive team when you're doing strategy planning and when you're doing end of year financial planning. I think that's extremely important. Doing more with less, I think it's focusing on, and again, this is just my opinion. I love hiring people that can write code because I think at the end of the day, we can build some really cool stuff that maybe we don't have to spend money on a specific tool if we can build it ourselves. And so I do love the ability to have, a good handful of engineers that are capable of building things, because then it changes the dynamic a little bit. If you can build your own automation scripts leveraging, AWS Lambda functions, you don't need to buy a tool to do something. And that's where you start saving money. And then you give people opportunity, because the days of people wanting to work in the SOC, I think, are kind of changing. And a lot of that's being outsourced to level 1 and 2 work. People want to build stuff. People want to spend their time building and creating. And I think that's one thing that I've tried to enable my team to do, is give them this place where they can build something. They usually are happy and their skills grow. And then the conversations are always positive about what's next for them.
Very cool. Yeah, that's a great approach. And building something is always, I think, it tends to be fun for people. I worked for a startup when I first got my start in security, and I had to teach myself all the security terminology and hired over 100 people in 2.5 years. And that level of challenge, but knowing that you're contributing to a greater goal and you see the tangible fruits of your efforts, I think that's so important. Being able to kind of put your stamp on something and say that you affected something. What about as far as like creating goals for your team so that they feel like they're being utilized in a big way? Like, do you do formal reviews and tie that back to goal setting, or how do you make that work?
So on our security team at Big ID, we did an offsite in Portugal where our entire security team got together. And we all talked about, I had every single person on the team say, what are the main risks that you want to address this year? Everybody wrote them down. And then I took the leaders that report to me directly, and we sat down again and was like, okay, great. Here's what we'll call our objectives for next year. I want all of us to sit down and how can we measure these to be successful? And so we kind of built OKRs, I guess, if you call it, for our security team from the ground up. We had everybody's input, not just like myself sitting in a room thinking like, what can I solve today? But really understanding the challenges of the people that are doing the work, that are on the front lines, that are dealing with, customer escalations or the vulnerabilities or, the endpoint detections, like the people that are really doing the hands-on work, that have the feel the pain directly. What do they want to solve for? Where do they think our biggest gaps are? And then working back from there is something we absolutely, that's kind of what we did this year, and it seemed to go well. And then you'll also see that when people get buy into the strategy, into the roadmap, you'll see that people are happy. People are getting to work on the things that they want to work on while still solving the security challenges that we all face.
Yeah, that's great. And I would imagine you would see some overlap when you ask everybody for their feedback of, the problems they want to solve. You're probably naturally going to get some people thinking about the same things, and that might be an indicator that maybe that's something you should focus on as a goal or
yeah, that's right. So after, and I left this out, but basically we took, all of the risks or all of the gaps that we identified, and we actually, stack ranked them based off of criticality of what we thought as a team were highest priority items that we needed to fix immediately. And you'd be surprised how many times the same people, everybody was unanimously deciding on the top 5 of yep, we need to fix this, or we need to work on this, or we should build this. And it's great when you see that everybody's moving in the same direction, lockstep. You're more of I don't want to say a military unit, but to some extent, everybody has the same mission that we're shooting for.
Yeah, and that's a common theme I've found among the hiring managers that seem to have the best relationship with their employees. There's a common purpose. Everybody's, quote unquote, rowing in the same direction or what have you. What happens though when you get somebody that all of a sudden, for better or for worse, isn't rowing in the same direction, or tends to provide pushback, or maybe is a little bit toxic? How do you tiptoe in that situation to make sure that things are still getting done, but you're still, I guess, serving as the leader with all the discretion that you can?
Yeah. So I think, again, it goes back to that alliance conversation of realizing that maybe this isn't the right place for you. Maybe this isn't the right job title. Maybe this isn't the work you want to be focusing on, but what is? And how do I help you get there? And whether somebody's very quote unquote toxic, or whether somebody is the highest performer, I want to know what makes them wake up every day and love their job or enjoy coming to work. And when they don't feel that anymore, let's have a conversation about it. And I think having those open conversations kind of alleviates some of the toxicity, I guess, if you will, from the team, because everybody's having an open conversation with me and their direct manager. And if we're aware of it, we can either, 1, help them get to a place where they're happy, or 2, be aware and help them, coach them up or coach them out kind of a situation.
Gotcha. Yeah, that's great. Yeah, you kind of turn the question on its head. You make it a very positive thing about the future of their career and where they're going. And if you address it that way and frame it that way, I'm sure that certainly helps.
And I think it's more than just saying it. It's actually believing it. I firmly do believe that all people are good and have the right intentions, but there's something in their job that is making them, whether it's the people they work with, whether it's the work that they're doing, that just isn't making them happy. And I think people should all be happy. And I think at the end of the day, it's your job as a leader to help get them there. And it may not be in your organization, and that's 100% okay.
No, that's great. And obviously, you kind of talked about job descriptions a little bit earlier. What are your thoughts on, I guess, when hiring for your team or just in general, I guess, certs versus experience versus education, degrees? Any thoughts on that?
There's very few certifications that I would say, oh, great, you have that. That's a person we should 100% look at. And it's usually when you're looking for somebody doing pen tests or red team type work, and if they have their OSCP, that's almost a must in that case. But for the most part, certifications I don't think they provide much value per se. And then that's not for every role, but for a lot of the roles, I don't know how valuable they are. work experience, being able to articulate why you built something as a leader or as an engineer, why you built something like that, to me is the most important thing you can tell.
Yeah, and that tends to be a pretty common theme from most folks I talk to on this podcast. It's really more about what you've done or what you can do than the letters behind your name or your degree.
And there's also something about it too. It's like, just because somebody can run the marathon, that doesn't necessarily mean that they've done it, they can run fast. But do you want the person who can hit the ground running, or do you want the person who can kind of come in and she can run long distance for a long period of time at your organization, and somebody who can grow into the role? And I think that's a hiring philosophy that a lot of people have to think about. What's important to you?
Yeah, and not just looking at current state or ability, but looking at future state of the employee that you're hiring. Because that person that showed a lot of promise may surpass that person that has more knowledge today. If you're hiring the right person, how do you identify that sort of potential when you're looking at hiring somebody?
So a lot of it comes from their eagerness and how hungry they are. I believe that if you have somebody who's extremely hungry, has the base skill set, and is very eager to learn and just be a sponge, I would hire that person 100 times over than the person who knows everything today, because there's a good chance that person who's a sponge is going to surpass that person who knows everything today.
Yep. Yeah, I tend to think the same way. But I think often in the field, what in general people default to when hiring is years of experience. How long has this person done this thing, or used this technology, or worked for a company like ours? Do you see that as an adequate, measuring stick of ability, or can it ever be adequate?
I don't know that years of experience matter at all, because a lot of times people sit in roles for 10 years, 8 years that they've learned nothing, but they know how to do that role. And it's not transferable to another organization or another company or another CISO role at another organization. So I tend to not necessarily care about the years of experience in a role. What I like to see is what they've done in the time period that they've been in that role. If you were leading cloud security at Amazon for 2 years, or you led cloud security at a large organization for 20 years, that person that was at Amazon probably has more applicable knowledge to what I'm looking for at Big ID than somebody who was at another, genre of organization. And that's just based off the nature of what they're doing at those places.
Yeah, I totally agree. I'm looking back at my own career, and when I worked for a startup and I was doing recruiting, and I set up the HR department and campus recruiting program and built an applicant tracking system, I did all these things in 2.5 years that I think most employees would be lucky if they did in 10, So like you said, it's very much about looking at what somebody's done with the amount of time that they had versus how long they were actually doing it. That said, I think there is some value in time in seat, so to speak. I just don't think it should be, the end all and be all, but I think often we kind of default to that as an industry. There's a sense that, if somebody hasn't done it for X, Y, and Z number of years, they can't possibly have the polish, or they can't have it down to a science, like somebody who's done it for a shorter amount of time. I see that often in the consulting world, where there's a sense that you have to kind of put in your time, so to speak, before you make it to the next level, especially IT auditors, for whatever reason. It's like you got to be a senior consultant for 2-3 years, then you make manager, then you're there for 3 years, then you make senior manager. I'm hoping we're kind of starting to get away from that as an industry, because I think talent doesn't necessarily know restrictions like arbitrary time periods to sit in a specific role.
Well, yeah, and the days of the CEO worked at a company for 15 years and then 30 years and they became the CEO. That's done. You have kids building startups at 18 years old and turning them into multi-trillion-dollar, billion-dollar organizations. Like Mark Zuckerberg built Facebook in a dorm room in college, and now is one of the most successful CEOs in the world and running one of the most successful companies in the world at Meta. I mean, 40 years ago, that would never be the case. And that's already changing. And so I think it's, the talent is everywhere. The opportunity is not always there, but with startups, it's becoming more and more prevalent that the opportunity is also becoming more available.
So obviously you've worked with smaller companies. Have you also worked for larger companies, and have you noticed the difference in how hiring gets done between the two?
So I spent 3 years at Zurich Insurance, which is a global Fortune 150,000 plus employees. So I've seen that side of it, and I've seen, Relativity, which was about 1,500 employees and growing. And now Big ID, we're about 500 employees and growing. So I've seen all three, like the large enterprise, the medium, and then now the startup kind of enterprise. And I think the larger organizations have more process and procedurals in place than a lot of the smaller organizations do. And that's just coming from a place of, I don't know if it's a risk calculation that they're doing or a series of checks just to ensure that something negligent isn't happening in the process, versus a startup that's just trying to get as many people in the door as soon as possible to go build something, because the end goal is we're trying to reach that pinnacle where the other companies are there, and they're trying to make sure that something doesn't take it off that pinnacle. So I think that's kind of the difference. The process is usually more robust at large organizations than at, even procurement, right? Getting software bought at a, Fortune 100 is much different than getting software purchased at a startup. Significantly different. It's like you talk to two people in an email and a procurement system versus talking, a 6,000, step process with 5 different reviewers and 4 different approvers in each step. Significantly different.
Yeah, I feel like almost once you start to scale up and get to certain company size thresholds, you almost inevitably incur more red tape, and there's really no way around it, because as your employee base grows, you need more support staff and administrative staff, and then you get more people putting their stamp on things. I don't know if you could have a large organization that operated like a startup. I don't know that I've actually heard of one. Have you? Even
the startups, like the Metas, the Amazon, AWS, the Amazons of the world, like their processes are just as robust as every other Fortune 100 now that's been around for hundreds of years, right? At that scale, you have to. There's risks associated. There's negligence that's happening. There's regulators. There's reasons why those processes exist.
Do you think the startups could learn anything from the larger organizations that have so many different steps?
Yeah, and I think eventually they get big enough or get acquired by one of those organizations, and they also adopt those same processes. That is one value of working at a large organization and going to a startup, is you can help replicate those processes that expedite the growth of specific functions in your organization.
Yeah, bringing best practices from the other side of the fence, so to speak. And I'm sure you could go the other direction with startups to help,
absolutely,
I guess, bring in some more agility to the larger, more stagnant organization.
Absolutely.
Yeah, totally agree. Well, we're coming up on time here, Tyler. So just one last question for you. Is there anything that we're not talking about in the industry, but we should be, especially as it relates to hiring?
I think it's something I've talked about, and it's, you should always be recruiting, always be communicating with peers and others in your network and in the security community, because at the end of the day, we're all in this together. There's a job shortage. There's a talent shortage. There's an exponential job opening gap that needs to be closed. And if we don't continue to work together, we'll never close it.
Agreed. Yeah. And hopefully with podcasts like this, we have more dialogue about these challenges that people are encountering. And I think it's just a little by little, one by one thing. We just need to talk about these things and get the solutions out there. So appreciate your time, Tyler. Thanks for being on. If people want to keep up with what you do, what's the best way to reach out to you?
Yeah. LinkedIn's the best. I think I can provide my LinkedIn to you as well, Pete.
Yeah, we'll put it up there.
Awesome.
So I won't forget it. So great. Thanks for your time, Tyler. And thanks, everybody.
Awesome. Thanks.
Hello, everyone, and thanks for tuning in to this episode of the Talent Gap Fireside Chat. Don't forget to follow our page on LinkedIn and like and subscribe on Spotify and YouTube. Hit that notification bell to be notified when we drop a new episode. New episodes air every Friday at 4 p.m. Eastern.